It's finally October, which means Halloween's right around the corner, and I get to talk about horror from the beginning to the end of the month. Now, I'm a fan of course, horror films, horror literature, and of course, horror video games, and I thought it fitting to count down my favorite horror-themed video games of all time. But I didn't want to just do one list. What we're gonna do is count down the best, or my favorite 10 horror-themed games from each generation, starting off with the old school, the second and third generation of consoles. To keep things varied, I'm only gonna pick one game per franchise per list, so I'm not gonna flood it with lots of Castlevania, though I easily could do just that. But without further ado, guys, this is my opinion, of course, but my favorite, and I consider the best horror-themed games of the old school era. To kick this list off, let's talk about one of the most obscure games on the list, and that is Midnight Mutants for the 7800s. Don't let the fact that Grandpa from the Munsters is on the box art and you even see his sprite in the game and interact with him. But this action-oriented horror game is one of the best on the Atari 7800, if not the absolute best game on the system. It has some cool settings and has some really nice effects with gigantic bosses. The skull boss, where it's actually kind of falling apart as you're fighting it, is one of the coolest moments that this game provides. While it may not be the best playing on this list, Midnight Mutants is a horror game that horror fans should definitely give a look to. One of the granddaddies of horror-based games, Haunted House for the Atari 2600, has you moving around as well just a pair of eyes. The lights go out, you're not able to see where you're going, the layout of the mansion changes depending upon your difficulty that you're playing on, and the placement of the items that you need to collect and then escape with always is changing up. Dealing with evil enemies that are going to move your items around, and a few different things to find, and some secrets as well. Haunted House may not be the most graphically intensive horror game, but it's definitely one that's worth looking at. Master of Darkness on the Master System, or Vampire Master of Darkness on the Game Gear, was Sega's answer to Castlevania, and it shows. There's a lot of Castlevania-esque gameplay, but it takes place in a different setting, the late 1800s in England, and there's not that many horror games on the Master System, and Master of Darkness does a good job at setting the mood, has some atmosphere to it, as well as some okay music that goes along with the setting. With references to stuff like Jack the Ripper, it definitely brings you into that time period and mode, and is still a pretty fun action horror game that's available on Sega's Master System. While this is a game that not everyone likes, Frankenstein: The Monster Returns won me over a few years ago when I first discovered it, mostly just due to the sheer amount of monsters and creatures that you got to battle throughout the course of it. It has pretty typical action gameplay, though it's far from perfect, trust me, but fighting stuff like your Death, Medusa, Frankenstein of course, as well as some really cool hybrid and creatures that you hadn't seen in other NES horror-themed games, along with a story that's told throughout the course of the game, and cutscenes, and a cool ending. Frankenstein Monster Returns may not be perfect by any means, but for horror fans, I think it's definitely worth giving a look. While unfortunately we didn't get it here in the United States, Splatterhouse won Paco Graffiti, the only Splatterhouse game to make it over to a Nintendo-based console, was a fun, chibi parody version of the main Splatterhouse series, but it threw in so many horror movie and horror-themed references throughout the course of it that it ends up being a really cool game. It plays pretty well and has some fun action to go along with it, with some interesting moments throughout the course of it. If you're a horror fan or a Splatterhouse fan and for some reason you've never checked out One Paco Graffiti, trust me, it's definitely worth tracking down and giving a try. One of my absolute favorites for the NES, Monster Party, with so many awesome horror-themed bosses and some really goofy ones as well, such as the Wishing Well or, of course, the fried food. It has so many references to not only American but Japanese horror themes throughout the course of it, and while it is a good playing action game on the NES, the best moment is that moment in the very first level when you're walking through, everything seems kinda bright and happy, well, for a horror game that is, and then all of a sudden the screen flashes, and now you're in a horror wasteland with blood and the creatures change up. It's one of the coolest moments for any game, especially a horror themed one on the NES, and why just one of the reasons I love Monster Party. one of the earliest horror-themed adventure games, and while it came out on many consoles, Uninvited for the NES was the first time I had a chance to experience the game. It was one I didn't appreciate until many years later, but once I did play it, the atmosphere brought me in. I love the soundtrack that goes along with it, and there are some great graphics with the ghost, and plenty of dead ends that you can end up running into throughout the course of your adventure. While this is a game not for everyone, because it's not really action-oriented by any means, but if you can appreciate an adventure game with some great atmosphere and music, you will definitely get into Uninvited. Now, this is a game I will throw on as many lists as possible, but I will argue Friday the 13th is one of the scariest games that the NES was able to provide. Just those moments when you walk into a cabin, you know Jason's there because you can see his health bar, but you're looking around and you don't find him, and you keep looking, and then all of a sudden, you go to the screen where he is, the music ramps up, you either get the adrenaline or you have to pause to take a deep breath before jumping back into the game and battling for your life against the masked creature. And then, once he escapes, you're out in the main field walking around trying to get to the next cabin to save some people, or just trying to find new items, and then all of a sudden, Jason's there again, and that whole same feeling comes back. This is definitely a game that relatively is short, but all those moments and never knowing exactly what's going to happen is why Friday the 13th is a great horror game during the 8-bit era. Like I said, I was only going to include one game per franchise per list, and I saved until number 2 to put on Castlevania III. This game is amazing. It has one of the best soundtracks that the NES was able to provide. And if you want even a better version of the soundtrack, playing the Japanese version with its enhanced sound makes the game even better. It is difficult as all heck, but with multiple different paths and multiple characters to play as, the replayability was huge in Castlevania III, and it still stands the test of time as one of my absolute favorite games available on the NES, as well as one of my favorite horror games of all time. If you've never given it a chance, Castlevania III is well worth at least attempting to play through. While working on this list, I actually came up with more horror games than I was expecting, enough to even fill up another list. But I did want to talk about a few honorable mentions here. First up, Halloween, as well as Texas Chainsaw Massacre on the Atari. Now, these are two horror franchises that never really saw love in gaming outside of the initial Atari 2600 games, and they were very scarce, hard to find, and a bit controversial for the time. But just the fact that there was a Halloween-themed game, as well as especially a Texas Chainsaw Massacre-themed game, where your goal is to run around and chainsaw people, is just such a cool moment for gaming, and for horror fans, it's worth looking at just out of the curiosity and love for those franchises. While it was never officially released, I really wish it had been. Drax Night Out has a cartoony look. You're playing as the Count, who's trying to escape villagers in a small European village while trying to get to his girl Mina. You have a Reebok sneaker that is a power-up that allows Dracula to run faster, jump higher, along with a few other Dracula vampire-based abilities to help you out. While it's not the best gameplay-wise, and I really think a little bit of refinement could have made the game really enjoyable, Drax Night Out is just so absurd, I had to throw it on this list. While the arcade version is far superior, Chiller on the NES was one of the goriest games available for the 8-bit system. It was unlicensed, so it didn't have to really worry too much about Nintendo's censorship policies. But the gore that was included, especially the torture chamber with people on racks, someone being lowered into the water while an alligator slowly eats their body piece by piece, this was stuff you never saw during the 8-bit era, especially due to Nintendo's strict policies. But Chiller is one of the most obscure, as well as one of the most interesting light gun horror games you'll ever find, though it honestly really isn't worth tracking down to play nowadays. It's an interesting curiosity, but if you want to see that real gore, definitely check out that arcade version. You probably saw this one coming a mile away, but Sweet Home is by far not only one of the best horror games of all time, it's also a really stellar RPG with so many elements going into it to make it stand out as a unique title. Not only do we still not see very many horror-based RPG, but the consequences, permadeath, and just the entire gore, puzzle solving, and creatures that you get to battle. Sweet Home is not only a great horror game, a good RPG, it was also based on a film, making it a licensed title. Sweet Home is still a relative hidden gem, though it's definitely gained popularity over the last few years. But when I first discovered this game, I couldn't believe that this existed. It's such a shame it never came here, as I'm sure it wouldn't probably have done all that well sales-wise, but just it would have allowed more people to know and appreciate the masterpiece that is Sweet Home. If you're an RPG fan and a horror fan, and you somehow have not played this game yet, you need to do yourself a favor and at least give it a try or watch a playthrough of it. I think you will definitely appreciate what you end up seeing. So there you have it, the 10 best horror-themed games of the old school era. Well, in my opinion, of course. What is your favorite horror game from the old school era? I'm going to be covering more lists in the future, covering the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th generation of consoles throughout the upcoming weeks, so be sure to be on the lookout for those videos. I hope if you're a horror fan, you enjoy October just as much as I do, and have a great and happy Halloween once we reach the end of the month. If you're watching this outside of October, hopefully it's not too long before we're back in the horror-themed month. But with that, guys, that's going to wrap up this countdown video. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.